All right, so today I want to talk a little bit about something called telepathy. And if you don't know what telepathy is, it's basically being able to communicate with someone using your mind. And why I want to talk about this today is that there's something that had come out fairly recently, and it was a series of podcasts, and it's diving into telepathy. And the podcast series is called the Telepathy Tapes. And part of the reason why it's starting to gain a lot of traction now is that Joe Rogan actually had the lady who created this, which is Kai Dickens, and he had her on his podcast. And I thought it was very interesting, some of the things that he covered. And I kind of want to dive into, what it is, some of the claims that are being made, and then why it's such a heavily scrutinized field. In fact, I would say that it's about, tying it all back into Joe Rogan again and people that he's had on his show. This is about as equally as a hot topic as ancient apocalypse, and I'll tie those two together later on. But again, very controversial topic, something that I think is going to spark a wildfire as it gets more popular. And hopefully Kai is able to use the telepathy tapes and with this traction get it put into a movie or a documentary series, because I think when you're talking about topics like this, the old adage holds true where extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof. And my biggest problem with the telepathy tapes is that it's all verbal, and you can hear some of it, which is great, and you can hear what she's telling you, but without actually being able to see it with your own eyes. I think skepticism is very high for these things because traditionally there's been a lot of skepticism just in general. So to overcome that, you need to be able to show us the things that you're claiming. But to go into a little bit more on what the telepathy tapes actually are and what they cover at a very high level, it's basically covering autistic children who are nonverbal. So they don't speak like you or I would. And what they do is instead they're able to communicate with their minds. And what it really focuses in on is that, yes, there can be some communication over great distances. And, there are some more fantastic claims that are being made here. But at a very base level and the most simplest is they're able to communicate with a couple of people, one person telepathically, and so they can read their mind and be able to respond, or even they can visit them in dreams. So on to the skepticism about it. The issue is with this, obviously being nonverbal, they can't talk, so there has to be some way to be able to communicate with what they're saying, or what, if they're able to read my mind, they then have to say what I am thinking or what I'm looking at, and they have to be able to describe it. So the major issue most people have with this is that the way that they are communicating lends itself to cheating, if you will. It's a discipline that is called spelling, and there are two main ways that this are done that people typically take issue with. Number one is sometimes some people who are providing the services, they will hold the arms of the individual to make them feel more comfortable, supposedly. And the issue with that is if you're holding their arms, you can squeeze, or you can basically give them some sort of nonverbal cue where they know that, oh, this is the answer that I'm supposed to give, or this is the way you can guide them, or something like that. So that's number one. The second is something called a stencil that they use, where they hold it up and it's basically a punch card with numbers and letters punched out of it. And they would basically take a pointer and point to whatever they were trying to spell out, or the numbers that they were trying to express. And again, the issue with that one is, assuming they're not, holding arms, there have been accusations that you can move the stencil very gently so that you can guide kind of where that pointer should go. And again, the only reason why I bring these up is because if you're making an extraordinary claim that there is telepathy, then you have to be able to prove that none of these things are occurring, because these are long held criticisms of spelling in general, but telepathy as a whole. Now, with all of that said, I will say that there were some examples in either what she was saying, or she has some video clips posted already that you can see online on the Telepathy Tapes website, where it actually shows some of these tests occurring. And the thing that is compelling is, in some of the instances, it would be, okay, the person who is receiving, so the autistic person, is in another room and they have an iPad and they're able to put in their inputs while the person who they're reading the mind of is shown a picture in a separate room. So there's no way that this could be communicated whatsoever outside of some sort of telepathy. I think those examples are very persuasive. But yes, when they're right next to them, or again, there's, spelling going on, which the thing is, I think with spelling is that it's still in its infancy stages because people haven't taken it seriously for so long. But I think as we move forward and we're actually looking at something like this more seriously, I think it's something where, yes, we can come up with more cheat-proof tests that we can administer to have more of a proof for the examples. All right, so we're going to dive in just a minute into, I think, some of the examples, because I've been a little bit more on the skeptical side of this one. I think a lot of people want to claim to be special, which I totally, I get it. That's something I think everyone likes to think, especially given spelling and the issues with that. I have had some reservations to buy into this idea, but what I will do is explain some of the examples of unexplainable behaviors and where I think that there are possibilities of this occurring, as well as some things that I've experienced myself. But before we get to that, I just want to take a quick second to say, if you've made it this far, if you like the videos that I put out, please, if you could, leave a subscription. That actually helps the channel a lot and helps me in my process of growing the channel. And as a bonus to you, YouTube will let you know whenever I create a new video. Let's hop into my examples. So the first example of this is the Mandela Effect. And for anyone that doesn't know what that is, it's essentially something that is named after Nelson Mandela. And he passed away in 2013, but it wasn't the way that everyone misremembered it to be. So the way a lot of people thought about it was that Nelson Mandela passed away while he was in prison, but he actually got out of prison in 1990. So he was out of prison for 23 years before he passed away, but everyone misremembered it. So what it did is it essentially popularized a bunch of things that people noticed that large swaths of the population also were misremembering. So some other examples of this would be like the Monopoly man having a monocle, whereas he doesn't. Or the Berenstein Bears. Many people misremembered them as the Berenstein Bears. Or Fruit of the Loom. Many people misremember that as having a cornucopia in the background, whereas it didn't. Or more recently, Pikachu's tail. These are all examples of things that are mass misremembered by large groups of people and all fall under the Mandela Effect. What's happening here, again, I think this one's a little bit more fringe, but just kind of one of those weird occurrences where we say, what's going on here, and we don't really have a good explanation. The second is déjà vu. And if you ever think about déjà vu, if you don't know what it is, it's when something happens and you swear that you've done it before. Do we really know what's going on here? The most common explanation for déjà vu is that you've done something very similar in the past, and it's just your mind recounting what you were doing before. So let's say I'm making a sandwich, and I get a very distinct feeling of déjà vu. Well, how many sandwiches have I made in my lifetime? The thing that gets me about that explanation, though, is that I personally have had déjà vu for things that are so specific that there's no way I have done it before. So déjà vu I'm a little bit more sympathetic to because, again, I don't think that there's a great explanation. I think sometimes, yes, it could fall into the category of things that you've done many times before. But, if it doesn't fall into that, we don't really have a great explanation of what's actually going on. Another example is when you're thinking about someone and they call you. And I think the interesting thing about that is that that's something where it actually closely aligns with some of the claims in the telepathy tapes, where they make this claim that there's an area where people who are nonverbal autistic go to congregate, and it's essentially called On the Hill. And the thing about it is it's kind of like a meetup, right? So the claims that I think are paralleled with when you get that call from someone that you were just thinking about recently is that basically you're able to communicate over long distances instead of just, room to room. You could be across the country and you're able to go in the telepathy tapes to a certain area to meet up. But in this instance, it would be, I was thinking about them. They live across the country, but they still just called me. So the ability to telepathically communicate over long distances. And again, this is something that is not really able to be explained, which I think is kind of the common denominator to a bunch of these. And then the final quick example that I find compelling is animals in nature and how they're able to, if you think of like a flock of birds or a school of fish, how they're able to move in tandem in large groups without any real sort of communication and in very rapid movements. So if you think about like a large amount of birds flying, I'm sure you've seen videos of it, but when they fly in a flock pattern or they're all taking off from the ground at once, how do they not run into each other? Same thing with fish. If they're moving in a big school of fish, they're making rapid movements to, evade predators or confuse them. How are they able to do that without just running into each other? I think those are all very interesting and unexplained things. So the main reason why I want to talk about this is essentially I have had some interesting experiences. And I don't want to claim that I'm telepathic or anything like that because that's insane. But I have had some inexplainable experiences, and it's actually with my dog. And so I've had her ever since she was a little puppy, and we would basically take her everywhere. And the interesting thing about it is that whenever she would go on a plane or up to altitude, I would get weird feelings that I would never have before we've had her. And the interesting thing about that is that even in between, so I've had this happen multiple times, but I would go on a trip without her and I would not get these same feelings. And again, I know these claims sound crazy, but I would be sitting on an airplane and I would have her in my lap and I would get these feelings from her of like, I don't feel well. I'm attributing it to her because I can't think of any other explanation of why I would have this. And it would be while we're on the ground. So there's no reason. But obviously she's stressed out because she's a dog and it's an airplane and she doesn't know what the heck is going on. But my stomach would like start turning in knots and I have no idea what's going on. Or the other instance is she doesn't do particularly well, or she didn't. The first time, for example, I took her up to altitude, she threw up in her cage. So there have been multiple times where I have taken her up into altitude and I get just completely nauseous. And there's no reason why. I've been up to altitude dozens and dozens of times. It's never affected me, but except for those few times where I have had my dog with me and she's a small dog, she just doesn't do particularly well with altitude. So I think in both of those instances, it's just very weird sensations. And again, I'm not saying that she could be beaming those feelings to me. I will try and calm her down by thinking, positive and calming thoughts in a hope that it influences her. But again, these are things that have happened to me that are not typical. I've flown hundreds of times. Literally the only times I've ever felt sick to my stomach is when I'm with her. And same thing with going up to altitude where I just feel completely queasy and like I want to throw up. So the only other thing that I kind of want to dive into is just things that have happened in the past that really have no explanation. And I don't think that it has to do with telepathy specifically, but to tie it back into Ancient Apocalypse, some of the claims from Graham Hancock in that series is essentially that there's a lost civilization that had great technological advances that we don't have today. And I think the best example of that is if you think about the pyramids. There are these fantastic structures with giant blocks, and the traditional explanations for how it was created just don't really add up. And just to dive into the metrics and what would actually need to be done to have created the Great Pyramid of Giza. So the traditional time frame that was given for that is that it was built within 20 years. In the Great Pyramid, it's estimated that there are 2.3 million stone blocks that would need to have been placed, which averages about 315 blocks per day. So given a 10-hour working day, working every single day for 365 days in the year, without accounting for any holidays, breaks, or other interruptions, that means that someone would have to have precisely put a stone into place every 90 seconds. That just doesn't really add up to me. So when you're talking about extraordinary claims like that, that's something else where I scratch my head and I say, well, if there are people out there who have telepathy, maybe there's the broader spectrum of what if there's something like telekinesis as well. And the difference between the two is that telekinesis is essentially being able to move things with your mind. And these are always very controversial because it's, people bending spoons, and there's a lot of magic, if you will, that gets kind of tried to shoehorn in with telekinetic abilities. But the thing that I've always thought about is, what if we had telekinetic abilities and they just have lapsed? We no longer have needed them. I mean, I think that there are multiple examples of stuff like this where gallbladder, you don't really need it. Wisdom teeth, we get them extracted anymore because they don't really serve a purpose. There are a ton of things like that where the way that we have evolved is no longer needed or no longer serves the world that we live in today. So could there have been a point in time in our evolution where, yes, we were able to move incredible objects with our minds? Sure, I could see it. I think it's kind of far-fetched if you think about where we are now, but it's something that's very interesting to me. And if you were to think about what's our competitive advantage, it's our minds. It's what we build, what we can do. If you take that to an extreme area where we're essentially saying that the mind is our superpower, versus if you think about other apex predators where they're super strong or they have specialized tools built into their body. We don't really have any of those except for our minds. So at one point in time, maybe we had these crazy abilities, but now, given that we haven't used them, we haven't needed them because we've evolved past it, if you will, well, they've withered and faded away. But maybe some people are still able to tap into these abilities out of necessity. Think about it. If you weren't able to communicate verbally, you would be so desperate to want to have a connection with someone that maybe the telepathy tapes are real. And I think I'm still going to reserve some of my judgment until I see an actual docuseries where I can see the video. Because once again, extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof. But I think it's something that's very interesting to think about. Anyway, thank you very much for joining me today. Let me know if you have thoughts on this. If you find this interesting or a compelling argument, have you had anything that has happened to you that falls into the category of my experiences with my dog, where it's just kind of weird and unexplainable? Write that all in the comments below. I'd love to hear what your experiences with telepathy are. I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you in the next one.